of us, I suppose, been having a very quiet time of it for the last couple of months, but I guess you can certainly say that it's a bit like buses, you know, you're waiting and then everything comes in one go, and that he is going to have a really busy day. Again, I suppose you're struck by the low keenness of it. I understand that woman that we were wondering who she was in the conference centre was actually Micheál Martin's niece, so that's a family member who was in Dublin.
I'm sure that was nice for him to see.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It's and even I think the fact that it's raining does, not wishing to be too, but cast too much of a pall over the occasion. I guess it's just it's the contrast between the normal, you spoke about this earlier, the busloads arriving at Leinster House, the bar being full, all the excitement, family members, friends, supporters, and just the sheer oddness of the bread and butter of politics, the handshake. We haven't seen one handshake today. The closest we got was, I think, I think he grasped his niece's elbow, right. But those are the times we live in.
Norma Foley, when she was nominating Micheál Martin, referred to the length of time this has taken, 140 days. We went and we voted on the 8th of February, and we're now here at the end of June. But she said, a hard beginning maketh a good ending. Will you just give your thoughts on the length of time this has taken, the difficulties, if you like, of just getting to this point, the extent to which that actually may well help to cement the relationship between these three parties?
I think that's a good point. For me, the dynamic is, look, Fianna Fáil are dying to get back in. And they realise, as I think it was Teresa was saying, that they have to, they have such a bad reputation in government after what happened with the crash, that they will want to be seen to do it properly this time. And Micheál Martin will want that to be seen as his legacy. I was fascinated to hear Leo Varadkar, not a man known for his humility, talk about learning or fixing the things that they didn't get right. And it was funny to hear Teresa saying that she was reading earlier about Fine Gael, being confused as to why they weren't seen to have done well in housing and health. That's Fine Gael's problem. This kind of, as I heard somebody describe it during the election, that rather than listening to what the voters are saying, they have this whole sort of like, my wife doesn't understand me vibe going on. They're like, what? You don't think we're amazing? And that this is something that comes up for them and that they're puzzled between the last election, the previous election. What goes wrong for us? Why do things seem to be okay up to the election, and then during the campaign we don't get there? So maybe they are going to take on this very unusual. It'll feel unusual to them anyway, in terms of humility. And I mean, I know we have seen a lot of bloodshed within the Greens in the last few weeks. But there was a call went out yesterday, an email from Party HQ of them trying to reunite, put the bitterness behind them. Now, there is the complication of the leadership election. And it is complicated now for Catherine Martin, isn't it? I mean, on policy terms, you had such a high vote for the programme for government, which is basically what they're saying is loosely the policy for the next couple of years. And also that Eamon Ryan swung that and brought it in. And even over the last 24 hours today and in his speech last night was looking very leader-like. So that shows how in the space of just a short, space of time, things can change in politics. No more now than we have seen the shift of power. An unusual thing happening where we saw it, where you had Leo Varadkar sitting a few seats away from him and power shifted from him to Micheál Martin. And now Micheál Martin is suddenly going to, we don't know why, or it's difficult to explain how it happens. Micheál Martin will, with the trappings of power, start looking more Taoiseach, or looking, not more Taoiseach-like, looking Taoiseach-like, full stop. Danny,
just talk a little bit about what this might do for the dynamic between the politically competitive dynamic between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael this period in government, because they'll be sitting in government together, ministers from both parties and the Greens, but let's just focus on these two larger parties for a moment. Sitting there in government together, and you either... In politics and in government, you either hang together or you hang separately. So they will have a mutual interest in their mutual success, will they not?
They certainly will, Brian. And I think what was very key was that on the day the programme for government was published, there was a second document, and that was basically the working document as to how the parties will interact, how essentially to avoid rows or how to deal with issues when they arise. In the Fine Gael Labour government, there was this inner cabal within Cabinet known as the Economic Management Council. It was a four-man committee made of the then Taoiseach Enda Kenny, Michael Noonan, Eamon Gilmore and Brendan Howlin. Now, while there won't be a kind of replication of that or a kind of a rigid replica of that structure. There will be a similar kind of clearinghouse structure between the three leaders in order to kind of address issues before they go to cabinet. I think the thinking is that any issues that go to cabinet have to be addressed by the leaders before, because you don't want any surprises building up or these sort of kind of bitter rows erupting. But as one Fine Gael TD said to me last night, it's going to be rather curious having the likes of Barry Cowan and Thomas Byrne having to go on radio and defend the likes of Simon Coveney and Pascal Donoghue, which they have never done before, because obviously they've been at odds before. So that will be an unusual circumstance that we're all just going to have to get used to. But ultimately, as I think Alison referred to earlier on, relationships are key to make a government work. And I think one of the key dynamics will be that interaction between Michael McGrath and Pascal Donoghue, because particularly when money issues are at play, they'll obviously have to upset an awful lot.
Danny, I'm just going to cut across you, sorry, because we have the formalities about to begin, and Sinead Crowley is standing by for us.
Tá de réir RTÉ a 30 an bhanreachta tá tú ag feicint picturíonn seo bio ó áras an Uachtarán agus tá an Tuachtarán a lámh a chuir le berantas ceapa agus séalaí ifige a bhrunna an Taoiseach nua Micheál Martin. You're looking at pictures here live from áras an Uachtarán, where President Michael D. Higgins is signing the warrant of appointment that will see Micheál Martin confirmed as the new Taoiseach. A slightly different ceremony here this year because of social distancing. You can see the two men sitting apart, the other men in the room, Secretary General to the Taoiseach and Secretary General to the President, both standing 2 metres behind to comply with social distancing. Ceapan Manish Gwilym Uachtarán President Michael D. Higgins there addressing a few words, because of course there's no handshake, no formal handover. Instead this year you see President Michael D. Higgins with the seals of office, seal of the Taoiseach and the seal of government. He places them there on the table. That table actually was first used in 2011 when Queen Elizabeth II visited Áras an Uachtarán, and the new Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, is now accepting the seals of office. Tá sé ceapan leis ina Taoiseach agus séalaí le hoifigh an And you can see flashes there from one photographer in Áras an Uachtarán today. Again, a quieter ceremony and fewer people than would usually happen at this time, but still a very significant occasion, of course, for Micheál Martin and for his family. The two men now leaving together. There would usually be meetings with the family gathered, but today a quieter occasion, but still some words being addressed, and again photographs being taken on the occasion. And the President and the Taoiseach will now go for a private meeting. They're going to the dining room at this stage. And agus an sin deire leis an searmanis an seo in Áras an Uachtarán searmanis rud beag éagsúil im líana ach ag an am céine anna hábhalta darnóí de Micheál Martin agus é ceapa go hifigúil ina Taoiseach an seo. That brings to an end the formalities here at Áras an Uachtarán, slightly different this year, but still a historic occasion for Micheál Martin, his party and his family. And we can go back to you now in studio, Brian.
Certainly both a historic and momentous for Micheál Martin personally, a momentous occasion, but also very different to previous occasions when Taoiseach-elect have travelled and made that journey to Áras an Uachtarán to receive their formal seals of office, seal of office as Taoiseach and of the government. But that has now been completed. So Micheál Martin is Taoiseach and will proceed back to Leinster House, as Danny was saying to us earlier. Then he and Leo Varadkar and Eamon Ryan will begin the process of assembling their government. The Dáil will reassemble, as we heard earlier, at 6 o'clock this evening, and then will hold its first meeting of this new coalition government. Will then take place a little later this evening following that. And certainly the indications from Micheál Martin in his remarks to the Dáil a little earlier is that no time is to be wasted in facing some of the challenges, the enormous challenges that the country is confronted with at the moment. Just in our final few few minutes, a comment we might just pick up if I can. Teresa there was talking, John, and Danny as well, about managing relations between these two parties. Now, again, I don't want to hark back again, but you've had a bit of practical experience of this. Dealing with the rows, and there will be rows. There's rows in single-party governments when we used to have them. There were rows in two-party coalitions. You have a three-party coalition. There will, of course, be the rows. Managing that and making sure that it doesn't destabilise the government. How do they do that?
It's a huge issue with difficulty, I think, is the short answer. I was reading the other night about William Norton, the Irish Labour Party leader in the first coalition in Ireland's first ever coalition, 1948. He stood aside from Labour leadership and devoted much of his energies to dispute resolution. You have to have a mechanism to manage. There are inevitably going to be rows. It's how you deal with the rows is the main thing. I remember the 2011-2016 Fine Gael Labour coalition was infamous for poor relations between not the politicians, but their immediate coterie of advisors. That is another issue that's going to have to be looked at here. Personal relations, we began conversation on this topic about Michael Noonan's comment about the need for good personal relations. And I think without trust, there will be nothing done by this government.
Yeah. And I mean, part of this, Alison, is that for the period of the last government, although confidence in supply has modified or changed the dynamic, but, it has been government and opposition. And you very often got the sense that Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar, there wasn't really any relationship there, and it could be quite frosty, to say the least, at times.
Yeah, I mean, it has come a long way, it seems, though, from that document that was drawn up before confidence in supply, which seems kind of innocent now, where they said that they wouldn't throw any surprises at each other. I suppose you have to have come from a political background, to have grown up in a political house, to where there was an allegiance to either one party or another, to really understand it, or where you heard stories from a grandparent. I know to people who haven't had, or younger people, it's something that's just a mystery as to why there would be this visceral hatred amongst some of them. And yes, between the Taoiseach and Micheál Martin, there are times across the Dáil floor when it really has been. I mean, most notoriously, I think that remark that Micheál Martin made about Micheál Martin being like a priest. And I sense, you got the sense afterwards that maybe Leo, regretted that, but yet he said it, and it will always remain on the Dáil record. So while at other times with Taoiseach and leaders of the opposition, they would stand up and they would argue and they would fight, you didn't feel there was needle there, but you always felt there was needle there between Leo and Micheál. But yet, all of this time has passed, as you mentioned earlier, the many months since we had the general election. I think both of them know now that to make it work, that's what the voters want. I think you can draw a correlation between the very high levels of support amongst the public for how COVID has been handled and how things have been done, as to that people want now realise that economically we need a steady hand and we need sound and sensible policies, and we need that supported. That's what people are looking for from the new government. Yeah.
Danny, another thing that just caught my attention in the remarks we heard earlier was the comments of Eamon Ryan, the Green Party leader, talking about cooperating with the opposition, engaging with the opposition, that, if you like, drawing something from the period of confidence and supply into this new, more traditional era of government and opposition. He particularly talked about, the committees. Let's keep up the good work they've been doing. Now, I mean, we have heard this. Oh, and by the way, also answering questions. Ministers answering questions in the Dáil when they're asked them. Now, I mean, we've heard this aspiration expressed before. Is there any reason to believe that it's more likely to be realised on this occasion than on previous occasions?
Well, it happened, Brian, out of necessity in terms of the sharing of time, or the move to allow ministers answer questions kind of in a Q&A session in the Dáil. That was all driven out of necessity because the minority government, they basically had no choice but to accede to the will of the Business Committee. This was one of the reforms that was brought in 2016, and ultimately the government didn't have a majority there, so it couldn't stamp its authority on the Business Committee. It will be very interesting to see now, in a majority situation now, how that Business Committee will work, because ultimately ultimately, if there's a majority in the Dáil favouring, supporting the government, there will be a majority in the Business Committee. So therefore, it may become a much more streamlined process where the government will just say, this is the order of the day, and that be it. Eamon Ryan, though, has been an advocate all the way through his political career about opening up and reforming and making the Dáil Mall accountable. I think one of the big successes of the new politics, Brian, was shifting that power from the executive to the legislator, and whether or not that power shifts back to sort of government buildings this term will be very interesting to see, or whether or not the opposition politicians and those independents who have essentially lent their support to the government, whether they allow that to happen. But ultimately, it's inevitable that with a majority government situation, the power base will shift back more towards the Taoiseach's office rather than the legislator. So that'll be, as I said, a very interesting dynamic to see how it fleshes out. Yeah. This sort of move to being all-inclusive was driven out of necessity, not out of goodwill. And in the absence of that goodwill, I can see bad old habits returning. Yeah,
I think Teresa, it was John Bruton who promised that he would govern behind a pane of glass. I hope I'm not misquoting him. I'm not sure that actually was realised as an aspiration. But there's also the role of the permanent government in all of this, isn't it? The civil servants. When ministers answer questions in the Dáil, they're very often the answers are prepared by their civil servants. So they're very important if there is to be any permanent shift in the way our government is accountable.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly there would be a culture change required in terms of how we approach accountability more generally. And there were some very worrying rollbacks on freedom of information legislation, for example, during the term of the last government. I think the Green Party is much more inclined towards transparency. It's part of how it does business, its identity. I would pick up on one point in relation to the Dáil reforms. Indeed, John Bruton was one of the Taoiseach who was instrumental in bringing forward more powerful committee structures. Once Parliament gets powers, it's very reluctant to give them back. So I suspect some of the reforms, which were quite positive in nature, will actually remain in there. We've had a proportional allocation of committee chairs using the Dahan system. I think pre-legislative scrutiny is generally felt to have been a positive thing across the board. That's where you bring in lots of people to discuss a piece of legislation before the actual final details of it are set out in a bill to go before the Dáil. And I think across parties there have been support for some of those key aspects. The bad habits that we want to probably look out for would be first guillotining of bills, and this time around the government will actually have a parliamentary majority to be able to push through its legislation, so it can call a vote and pass its legislation. But guillotining of bills is a bad thing to do. It reduces the amount of scrutiny that legislation gets, but it also sets a kind of a bad parliamentary tone in terms of limiting the role of not just opposition TDs but also backbenchers within the parties themselves. So I think some of those things will persist. The way the Business Committee operates is going to be probably the most interesting thing. In the last Dáil, the government just didn't have the votes to be able to set its own agenda if other parties decided to vote against it. This time around, the government will have the votes to set its own agenda. But I think, again, if there are wise heads in government, they will tend to stick to a more open and more accountable Dáil, because that was a positive change under the last term. It was very difficult to evaluate Dáil reforms the last time around because it was a minority government. Dáil reform will be easier to evaluate its effectiveness this time around because there is actually a government with a capacity to kind of push the limits of the reforms.
Yeah, we've been talking quite a bit in the last little while about the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael dynamic and relationship and how that might play out. But let's just pause to give some consideration to the third leg, if you like, in all of this. The Green Party, which has now entered government for the second time. The previous time, of course, was with Fianna Fáil. On this occasion, they're joined by Fine Gael as well. Our reporter Maggie Doyle takes a look at the re-emergence of the Green Party following its electoral collapse in 2011.
The story of the Green Party is one of numbers, starting in 1989 with one, their first TD in Dáil Éireann. Roger Garland wanted environment on the agenda.
I think a Green vote, first of all, shows clearly that people are interested in ecological politics, which are not being pursued by the other parties.
double the numbers in 1997 with the election of John Gormley and Trevor Sargent, who would both become party leaders. By the 2007 general election, the party had returned 6 TDs. But the decision to go into a coalition with Fianna Fáil led to the wipeout of the party's support. The Greens, with 2 ministers, were there through the banking crisis, the financial collapse and soaring unemployment. They clung on until the relationship with their government partners was no longer tenable.
We believe it is time to fix a date for a general election in the second half of January 2011.
What followed was a total collapse in the 2011 general election. The Green Party lost all their seats. The new leader, Eamon Ryan, planned the comeback from this nondescript building. How did he get from 0 to 2 to 12 seats in Dáil Éireann?
I believe the fact that Eamon Ryan had been a minister and had been seen to be a very competent one was certainly an asset. But climate change has been a huge issue in the intervening years. And I think that really is the rising tide that's lifted the Green Party to this point. It's been the longest, loneliest road back for Eamon Ryan.
Last year, the schools' strike for climate, described as the largest global climate protest in history, coincided with a political green wave, which saw the Green Party gain 59 council seats, 2 MEPs and a 3rd TD in a by-election, before becoming the 4th largest party in February's general election.
If they didn't do well in the most recent election, they're never going to do well, because that was this is their time as such, and especially with a global campaign in support of them. At the moment, I think the Greens have a much stronger, unlike the last time, there's 12, they've double the amount of seats they had the last time, and they're working with 2 parties as opposed to 1.
Eamon Ryan's next challenge is to keep his position, with Deputy Leader Micheál Martin contesting his leadership. Green Party members will be asked to vote again in a matter of weeks. The date for the leadership election is July 22nd. But for now, the party that Eamon Ryan brought back from beyond the brink takes its place back here at government buildings.
Maggie Doyle reporting. Can I bring you in on this, Danny McConnell, the Green leadership contest now? Where's all that at this stage, do you think?
It's a very curious position we find ourselves in, Brian, that given the fact that, Micheál Martin was essentially called upon to stand by members of the Green Party. There was a group of 4 in Cork, Lorna Bogue amongst them, who had called on her to stand because they were essentially not happy or content with Eamon Ryan's leadership. Now, the Green Party have said this is part of their constitution. They do this to make sure that no one power or one faction assumes total control of the party. But the timing of all of this has been more than curious. It has been, frankly, destabilising. I think it definitely had an impact on the government formation talks. If you talk to Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil negotiators, they repeatedly say, which wing of the Green Party are we negotiating with? And now that the fact that they not only have the party grassroots endorsed it in such large numbers, but the fact that Micheál Martin, who had opposed the idea of going in, now is likely to be serving in cabinet, you're wondering what her platform for change is really going to be all about, given that Eamon Ryan has essentially won a pretty sizable victory and endorsement for going into government. And as Alison said in an earlier segment, I mean, his leadership credentials have certainly been well on show over the last 7 days or so. There had been a clear nervousness amongst Green Party members that the deal was likely to go down. But certainly, speaking to an awful lot of those on the yes side in recent days, they worked very, very hard to get their vote out, to manage the vote in their areas, in their constituencies. And what they certainly did manage to do was convince the middle ground, who may have had doubts or concerns about going into government. They were able to convince them that this was better for the party and better for the country to do so. This contest will now play out. There's certainly no great love for Eamon Ryan amongst some members of his own party. I think there's some people who see him as acting sometimes in his own interest rather than in the party's interest. There is a concern that he doesn't appeal to rural-based Green Party members, that he's very much Dublin-focused, and that, I think, is somewhat of a legitimate criticism. But ultimately, and that Micheál Martin, as a Gaeilgeoir, as someone who is from rural Ireland, can speak to that constituency far better than Eamon Ryan can. So it's down to a personality issue rather than, say, one of policy. But this is, certainly her argument is certainly diluted somewhat by the fact that the party has agreed to go into government, and that Eamon Ryan was essentially the man who drove that process through.
And John Downey in Leinster House, what would be your assessment of Eamon Ryan's leadership position at the moment?
Well, I think it's hugely strengthened on the back of that vote. I think the party, you see, this is another example. They always say the Greens do things differently, and they do. In any other situation where somebody is challenging for the leadership of the party, they would not have remained as deputy to the person they're challenging, and it would be far more clear-cut. It's a funny and insidious type of process. On a kind of technical point and for future reference, there may be a move within the party to change this or vary this 6-month rule. They did reasonably, some of the members of the Green Party said to me, look, we had this rule that within 6 months of an election there must be a leadership contest. We had that rule existed when Taoiseach were elected within weeks, if not days, of a general election. We never imagined a situation where there would be months of a hiatus. But I think right now Eamon Ryan is very much strengthened. As I said earlier, 8 out of 10 ordinary branch members backed this coalition deal, and I think there can be no doubt about his leadership from this on.
Yeah, his achievement, Teresa Reilly, has been really quite extraordinary. We've talked a lot during the course of this programme about Micheál Martin and the role he's played in bringing his party back into power now at this point after the collapse it suffered in 2011. But Eamon Ryan can take credit. I'm sure there's others around him who also worked on the task, but can take a lot of credit for saving the Green Party and re-establishing it as a national political force.
Absolutely. I think at times Eamon Ryan's organisational abilities and organisational skills have been overlooked in the course of a lot of the discussions. In 2011, there were no TDs and the party effectively had no state funding. And Eamon Ryan, along with Ciarán Cuff, they kept the organisation alive. They ensured that they had a full slate of a candidate in every constituency in 2016. They made significant gains at the local elections in 2014. And they did all of that without any kind of support structures that all of the other political parties take for granted. And that's testament to the organisational skills of the people who remained with the party, but also to their commitment and fervour. And I think that's important in terms of understanding and analysing the Green Party. They're a party driven by a fervour, a deep commitment to their core policy agenda, which is in relation to environmentalism. And for that reason, the party survived an electoral wipeout that perhaps would have diminished another type of force. So I think that is particularly important. I think one of the interesting things to say as well about the Green Party in relation to those high levels of internal party democracy is that actually other parties are drifting in that direction. So the Greens were one of the first, to empower all of their members to have a vote when it came to selecting candidates at election time. One member, one vote. It's called. And all of the other political parties have gone in that particular direction. The Greens had votes for their ordinary membership when it came to choosing the political parties. And as we've seen, actually, the other political parties have gone in that direction as well. And I kind of temper a little bit this idea that you can't have a leadership contest and then go on to work together effectively. In fact, Fine Gael just did that in relation to the changeover after Enda Kenny. Leo Varadkar and Simon Coveney fought a leadership contest. Now, it was pretty much over before it started, but nevertheless, there was a series of national hustings, and those two went on to become, very effective colleagues in government, and in fact, kind of a key part of the axis of power now within Fine Gael. So there's no reason to say that the Green Party can't do the same. But certainly, with regards to internal party democracy and empowering members, the Green Party has led the way, and others have followed.
Yeah, I suppose the difference between Fine Gael in that case and now with the Greens is that there was a vacancy in the Fine Gael leadership, and this is a challenge to an existing leader, which is it's often described as a heave. Doesn't seem quite the phrase to apply to the Greens, but that's more or less what it comes down to. It's a challenge to somebody who's in place.
There were moments when it first came up when it felt like that, and I think that we've said earlier the Greens have always been different, and yet what's been interesting to look at is to see that how you were thinking they were behaving more like a political party in recent weeks in terms of that you saw there seemed to be these factions and that you didn't know was there sort of backstabbing going on. You saw Oisin Smith, I think it was on prime time the other week, where he said, like, I don't hate Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, acknowledging that there are people within the Green Party who did. So that you now have a scenario where there's a very vocal group within the Greens who may or may not be very bitter now at the idea that the Green Party has gone into government. And human relations being what it is, they may say we're different, but there must be hurt there within the party now. Eamon Ryan must feel a measure of hurt. I have always in the past found Catherine Martin to be a very impressive woman. She did a wonderful job of setting up the female caucus within Leinster House. But it's been very difficult to see Catherine Martin in the last 2 weeks. Even within the negotiations, the other parties would tell you that she was very quiet. And for them to try and get a measure of her. But I would, as I said earlier, I think at this point she has a difficulty in finding legitimacy in her leadership bid now after Eamon Ryan managed to so resoundingly get this across the line, and that such a high level of membership agreed with him. So they say they do things differently, whether they'll just be able to, get on with it. But really, I think, frankly, they could do without a leadership contest now, and so could the rest of us.
I'll pick up on that in just a moment, but we just had some pictures sent to us of some of Micheál Martin's supporters and party workers in Cork, and they've gathered there. They're watching. That's watching our coverage, I think. There they are applauding his election as Taoiseach. They're in the conservatory of Councillor Terry Shannon there, I'm told, who was his first director of elections. So they're seeing now the culmination of the political career of someone who they've worked with over very many decades. So you can understand their delight and enthusiasm at that. Just sticking with the Greens' role in this government and how they've come to this point and how it might play out for them. Maybe I'll bring you in on this, Danny. It just struck me, listening to the debate within the Green Party about whether or not to approve the programme for government, that there were two distinct strains. There was one that said, look, we haven't got everything we want on tackling climate change or the social issues that we are concerned about, but we've got as much as can be got, and our responsibility and duty is to go into government and try to realise as much as that as possible. And on the other hand, an argument that said it's not enough, it's not adequate to our ambition, and we should stay out and wait for the next opportunity to arise. Now, it seems on the strength of the Green Party vote that it is the former of those two arguments, get in there, get stuck in, achieve what can be achieved, has won out.
Without question. I mean, you go into a coalition government, you have to compromise, and clearly the Greens have had to compromise on several issues. They have won gains, significant gains, and probably Shannon LNG, the liquefied nitrogen gas facility down in the Shannon Estuary is probably their big win. That, I suppose, the win in relation to getting the 7%, the roadmap. But what you're hearing from the likes of Nessa Harrigan, Francis Noel Duffy, and Patrick Costello, those the three TDs who opposed the deal, was that the concerns around how vague the document is in places, and that would be a concern. But again, like, there's so much. It's 100 pages long, 120 pages long. There was so much in it that it was, I suppose, impossible to be more specific, given, I suppose, that the financial circumstance the country finds itself in. But there's always that balance and that tug of war between, are you ever going to get everything that you want, or are you much better off being in government, sitting at the cabinet table? I was very interested to hear Finian McGrath on the radio with Sarah McInerney yesterday making that very point, that and he pointed to very specific examples of how he, as a Minister for Disabilities, intervened on a topic to get it over the line and get it done. And it wouldn't have happened had he not been there. And it was a very visual illustration as to how being at the table can really matter. And I think that argument certainly swayed the majority clearly in the Green Party, because I think it would have been seen, had they not gone in, given I suppose the winning of 12 seats in the Dáil, given that they're going to have 7 ministries at junior and senior level, it would have been an opportunity far too good to give up or to miss out on. And I think they would have been kicking themselves had they spurned that opportunity, because had a second general election been called, I think a lot of people would have looked at the Green Party and said, listen, we gave you the opportunity, we voted for you to go in and effect change, and you spurned that opportunity, and therefore they would have sought their revenge, I would have thought, at the ballot box.
Yeah. Alan Kelly, if I can bring you in on this, John, talked about about the programme for government. The financials, he said, are comical. We know there's very little costing in it. The now government parties argued, well, that's not what you do in a programme for government. But there's also a lot of deferring, as we were saying earlier, of decisions on issues to reviews and commissions and so on. But now, this Saturday afternoon, we're just, hours away from the rubber hitting the road. They'll start to have to make decisions, won't they? And those are the battles that will be fought out week in, week out, between the two parties, between ministers around the cabinet table.
Certainly. And I mean, the programme for government is your design for the life of this government, and it will be sort of on every printout of it, a well-thumbed printout of it will be on everybody's desk, people associated with this government. Of course, Alan Kelly points to the absence of cash. I heard Sinn Féin the other day saying there are more reviews in this than you'd find at a film festival. Eamon O'Keefe criticising, saying the word review, study, consolidation, it's in the 70s or early 70s, the number of times that phrase occurs. All those criticisms are there, all that scepticism is there, and part of the job of this government is to deal with that and hopefully dispel it by implementation.
I'm reminded, Alison, of the phrase that Leo Varadkar used in relation to the roadmap for reopening the country. It's a living, evolving document. And kind of programmes for government are a bit like that as well, aren't they? They have to change and adapt to the circumstances as the government finds them.
They do, but I think most particularly in the current circumstance, you also have the idea, and I think this was something that the Greens said, look, we have to try and tie down what we want, because if we don't, we won't get it when we're in there. That, we may be promised reviews, but they won't happen. But by necessity, I think, we don't know what's happening from week to week in terms even of opening the economy, if things will have to be shut down again. So which makes it really difficult to make financial projections. We could be in a very different place in October to compare to what we are now. Now, I've just got, from what I call a very good source, a quick run through of portfolios in terms of parties.
Please.
I hope I'm saying that Fianna Fáil getting health, housing, education, public expenditure, and maybe a sport and youth, which was new and on me. Right. Fine Gael then, obviously, the Taoiseach and Jobs, Department of Finance, Pascal Donoghue, Foreign Affairs, Agriculture, Social Protection and Justice. And then for the Greens, Eamon Ryan, as we already know, that Climate and Transport. Catherine Martin, Arts, Culture and Media. And then Roderick O'Gorman, Children, Integration and Disabilities.
All right, OK. So I think that overlaps with some of the, I don't know if you heard that, Danny, but Alison's list there of ministerial appointments and how they might be sliced up pretty well, is parallel to what you were saying. What will you watch for at 6 o'clock when the Dáil resumes and ministerial portfolios are assigned?
It'll be very interesting to see exactly which Fine Gael minister takes the Department of Justice. I'll be very interested to see exactly who in Fianna Fáil might get education and which members of Fianna Fáil, because obviously there has been talk of whether Barry Cowan or Thomas Byrne would make the final cut, but whether the likes of Norma Foley, whether she managed to get that Super Junior position or not, because this competition has obviously stepped up. There have been some talk internally that Anne Rabbitte, albeit that she has been their sole female negotiator during the talks, had stumbled a bit and annoyed some people by kind of making it clear that those who have opposed the deal needed a slap on the ankles. That did not go down well internally, and Norma Foley certainly seems to have impressed since arriving in the Dáil, so she very much is in contention. So it'll be very interesting to see the pecking order. OK, I'm sorry to cut across you. We're back at our Saluteron there, where the President is just making his farewells there to Micheál Martin, who leaves now with his seal of office to return to Leinster House and to begin making those phone calls. And there'll be more people waiting by the phone than will get the call they're hoping for. We can be pretty sure of that. And we will know later in the day exactly the composition and the duties, the assignments, the portfolios, the distribution of responsibilities within this new government, this new three-party coalition government. So that will be, we should know from 6 o'clock this evening. Well, we've had some well-informed reports from our guests on how it all might look out. We thank them. There just is
Mr. Martin's motorcade leaving the gates of our Senachtaran. So it just falls to me to thank our guests for being here in studio. We've been on air a little bit longer than we expected, so our apologies for keeping you back rather longer than I think we might have indicated earlier. But we appreciate you being with us here for what I think we've all been reflecting over the last couple of hours has been a remarkable and historic occasion, an unusual occasion, not the scenes that we have witnessed on previous occasions when the Taoiseach has taken power, but nevertheless a moment of a great significance in our politics when the traditional political rivals who've dominated the decades of our national political history are together now in government with the Green Party. So as Micheál Martin heads down Chesterfield Avenue there back towards the gates of the Phoenix Park, I thank Alison and Danny and Teresa and John for being with us. We appreciate all your time and your insights. Thank you for that. And we are, I think, going to leave you just with some of the sounds of the last, scenes and sounds of the last number of hours. So thanks very much indeed for being with us, and a very good afternoon to you.